Pessoal, boa tarde. Para os que não me conhecem, para os que me conhecem também, eu sou o Daniel, professor aqui do Departamento de Educação Física, e vou ter o prazer de introduzir e apresentar o professor Edmundo Acevedo, que vai fazer a nossa última fala do dia de hoje. Só apresentando um pouco do professor Edmundo Acevedo, ele possui bacharelado em Educação Física pela Universidade de Springfield, a mesma dos Simpsons, mestrado em Fisiologia do Exercício pela Universidade de Maryland e doutorado em Fisiologia da Atividade Física pela Universidade de North Carolina at Greensboro. Atualmente ele é professor permanente da Virginia Commonwealth University e diretor do programa de acesso de estudantes de primeira geração a ingressarem no ensino superior na VCU, que é a universidade da qual ele vem. E foi chefe do departamento de cinesiologia e ciências da saúde por 10 anos. Ele é membro de várias entidades científicas como o American College of Sports Medicine, American Physiological Society, American Psychological Association, Association for Applied Sports and Psychology e National Academy of Kinesiology. Possui mais de 100 artigos publicados em periódicos científicos e 5 livros, somando quase 4.000 citações, tendo orientado inúmeros estudantes de mestrado e doutorado de várias nacionalidades. O professor Acevedo estuda principalmente o impacto do estresse mental e do nível de condicionamento físico na saúde dos indivíduos. E examinou o efeito de desafios físicos e mentais simultâneos nas respostas cardiorrespiratórias e nos indicadores de inflamação e função da parede endotelial. Mais recentemente, seu grupo de pesquisa conduziu vários projetos de pesquisas focados no comprimento dos telômeros, um marcador biológico de idade celular. Bom, o professor Ed atualmente está em visita técnica de pesquisa aqui na UFRN, já há 3 meses a essa altura, com bolsa da Fulbright, que é uma instituição americana. Então, nós somos bastante felizes de tê-lo aqui. Seja bem-vindo mais uma vez. E, por favor, professor Edmundo Acevedo, salva de palmas por gentileza.
I think part of that applause is for the collar and the long pants. That's very unusual. I know it's just for me.
You deserve it. Vocês podem confundir ele um pouco com George Clooney, mas...
George Clooney, I can see that.
The only thing on the George Clooney reference, I've been the one to tell everybody I look like George Clooney.
Google as well.
I had to start the rumor.
Google images.
Of course, I want to start with saying thank you to the organizers, right, for putting this together. I know how much work it is, or how much work it must be to try to make this happen. And also thank you to the other presenters that have come from far away and not so far away. I know how much time it takes to prepare, to travel, to get ready. So I personally appreciate your investment. And of course I had to say yes when I was asked, because I eat beer. But also I think the students should feel very, very fortunate to be here at this time when you have energized faculty who are trying to make a difference, trying to add more to your educational experience. And so I think you're very, very lucky. And I am very, very lucky that you're still here. I really appreciate that. And I'll do the very best I can to stay on target, keep us moving forward, stay high energy, and be funny. That's the hard part. That's the hard part. But I'll try. Again, thank you for being here. I feel fortunate to be a part of this as well. Well, just to show you where I am a little bit, here's Washington, D.C. Richmond is right here. I'll do a little bit larger picture. This is Richmond, Virginia. That's where I'm from. It snows there. And I think today they're going to have very cold weather, maybe 30 degrees, which is, how much is that in Celsius? Anybody good with math quickly? It's almost 0. It's right about 0 Celsius. So that's what they're having. And this is Halloween. This is Halloween for us in the States. So there's going to be many little children with costumes on freezing to death. I have to show you this building. This is our new building. We moved into this building in July, and I left the country in August. But this is our new building. We just moved into it. It's an amazing brand new building. Please come visit. If you ever come through Virginia, just let me know. We'll take you for a tour and we'll try to get you signed up for courses. But this is the kind, everything in it is brand new. When they built the new building, the commitment was to not bring any old furniture, any old equipment. That was not allowed. We didn't make that decision. It was the upper administration, because they wanted to show it off to the whole world. And they wanted to take pictures like this. And they felt the only way they could do that, so I think they invested $1.8 million of all new equipment, which is, it's insane. It's insane. But very, very nice, and something I'll be going back to. So here are my presentation themes. There's no big surprises here if you're trying to understand the broader context of this presentation. We're going to talk about background knowledge and history of the study of stress. Stress is this really broad term that we use for a perturbation of the system, right? And it can be a mental perturbation or perturbation initiating in the brain, or it can be a perturbation initiating in the body, right? I'll get back to that in a moment. We'll talk about the fight or flight response, because this is the acute circumstance of stress that we can manipulate in the lab. And so all the studies I'll be talking about are studies in which we manipulated stress, the fight or flight response, in the lab. A little different than some of the presentations today that are epidemiological or even broader approaches to human behavior. This one is very targeted to physiology and what's happening in the body. It's just that we're going to incorporate something happening up here with something happening here, which is new. It's not the norm, at least in the literature yet. Then we'll talk about this notion of physiological toughness and the cross-stressor adaptation hypothesis. I'll just throw that out there. We'll get back to that, and I'll explain it to you later. And then stress, the inflammatory cytokines, and cardiovascular disease. That's the link between mental stress and heart disease. It's these inflammatory cytokines. And I'm sure it's many other things, but because I'm doing the talk and my research is on inflammatory cytokines, I'm going to focus on those. And then obesity as a chronic stress. We have looked at obesity and obese individuals in particular because it's clearly a chronic stress. And obese individuals have a higher resting level of pro-inflammatory cytokines. So they're a nice population to look at, clearly high risk for many reasons often. Well, stress can be anything, right? You can get stressed out for a lot of reasons, like kind of relationship stress, maybe homework stress, maybe financial stress, and just stress over injuries, right? It's just part of life, and we all experience it. Sometimes we feel like maybe everything's coming at us, we're about ready to explode, and something's going to push us over the edge. All of us understand this feeling as humans, or this sensation as humans. We might not understand this feeling, but there's all kinds of stress. We can find ourselves in all kinds of dire circumstances. The reason I look at this is because stress is perceived, right? I'm not so sure if this fellow's stressed beyond me, but I'm not so sure. But it's something that we perceive in many regards, unless it's the physical type of stress. Now, this morning I woke up and I thought I was going to be humorous, but I caused stress for our family. Family stress is another big area of stress. And so I'll tell you a little bit about this stress. What happened is, I saw this picture, I think, Dardo, I think you had it up there, and I said, who is that guy? Because something happened, right? I don't think I look like that person anymore. I think it's the 10 or 12 weeks in, you better be careful, I don't know what you're gonna look like by the time you leave, right? So what I did, though, just to be funny, is I sent I WhatsApped a picture to my two children, 25-year-old and a 28-year-old. They're very worried about us being here because they think we're old and we left the country and what are you doing and all that. So I sent them a picture, this picture. I thought it was funny, right? I mean, I'm George Clooney, whatever, but it's funny, right? But I added to it, what tattoo should this person have? And it caused tremendous stress. They're very, I'm a midlife crisis. They've got to have a midlife crisis. Again, Al, be careful. But you can have all kinds of stress. That's a funny example of just kind of, being kind of alerted immediately about this. And I hope I really don't look that way. I look so scary. I hope I don't look
great.
What were the charges?
What's that?
What were the charges?
Yeah, that's right.
Just the
Looking like George Clooney, maybe. All right, here we go. But physical activity is a stressor. It's a physical stressor. All of us here are committed to stressing people physically. That's how we instigate the adaptations that are beneficial to our health, unless we overtrain. But we never really talk about that in the general health environment, right? Even though that's there. So really, we're in the business of stress, but we're in the business of physical stress, right? Now, what my whole goal will be today is to try to convince you, number one, that the brain up here and the body are connected in every way possible. If something happens here, it's going to have an effect here, and if something happens here, it's going to have an effect here. And if it doesn't have an effect, it's because it's being blocked somehow. You're one human being, you're connected. You're not a brain, and you're not just a body, you're one. So I want us to really anchor in on that, because that's the primary message, and if you leave and that's all you remember, that's great. Right? But don't leave. The other thing I want to show is kind of how critical it is in science to be seeking expertise outside of your comfort zone, to learn more about addressing the research questions that you're interested in. And feeling comfortable with saying, I don't know anything about that. Who does? Where are they? I'll send them an email. I'll see if I can have a coffee. It's an amazing experience to do that. It allows you to grow, and you'll see how that has happened throughout my research career. Stress. This is just kind of a textbook. You read a book and you see this is the definition of stress. It's really general, it's really broad. It's one of the frustrations I have with trying to understand stress research, but it's out there, and I don't know how else to describe it anyways. It's a perturbation of the system, period. It's a perturbation. And we measure whether you're stressed or not based upon the perturbation. That it has to be, that's it. It's simple and actually complex, and even maybe confusing. Hans Selye to the left here, that's his picture, comes from an article by Jackson, so it's cited as Jackson. That's Hans Selye. He's the first person to describe kind of this stress process, and I'm sure almost all of you have seen this. I'm sure you've seen it. But you have the stressor, some alarm, then the body builds a resistance, so you adapt. You don't quite adapt because it's not a steady state adaptation. But you have a response to it where you're resilient to whatever the stress is. And then if it stays too long, you hit an exhaustion phase. And this is generally what Selye would have said causes the disease. That's when you become diseased, right? Now, many things have happened in the area of stress research since Selye, and it's changed to a pretty, I think, important degree, or a significant degree, in that we're looking at now understanding the combination of systemic reactions, right? And how many different stressors can influence your health or physiology at once. So it's rare that you just have one stressor in your life, right? I hope you have very few or little stressors, but most of us are worried about this, about money, about the wife and kids, about the girlfriend, about the test next week, about, I'll say money again, and I'll say money again, right? So many of us are exposed to many stressors. And it was always felt like Selye's model didn't quite get to that. Well, the notion of allostatic balance or allostatic load clearly does, and tries to explain it to us more completely. And it allowed our understanding of stress to move towards this type of model, right? And here we can see, it wasn't, again, until someone started to use different terminology that we could start to talk about multiple stressors really influencing your health overall. So we have chronic social physiological, major life trauma events. We have individual differences in how you cope with stress. We have behavioral responses that are adaptive or maladaptive that can also influence the stress. Then we have a physiological response that's going to alter the balance between allostasis and an adaptation, and this load becomes the critical measure. So when we now measure stress physiologically, we're really measuring some level of allostatic load, right? And this is everything, even though we might only be initiating or instigating or interested in one factor having an influence. The reality is there are many factors and we're only looking at, let's say, a number of outcomes or variables indicative of allostatic load. So, I mean, you know, as I mentioned, there's good stress and there's not so good stress. So what's the big deal, right? Well, the reality is, okay, not all stress is bad. It can still be stress and good. An example is, my wife is here. But I have to tell you that when we got married, that was a long day. That was a long. We got married 34 years, so we did pretty good. But I was exhausted. I was stressed out. It was a traumatic experience. Not anymore, and I've forgotten most of that part. But that's a positive thing that happened. And it was still very, very stressful. I think it's important to kind of understand that about stress and balancing it all out. High percentage of working age population report experiencing stress, possibly 50%. And it's a different 50% every day, but if you ask them every day, 50% are stressed out at work. It's not pleasant, right? Which I think is really interesting. More women than men report being stressed. It might not be the case that more women are stressed than men, but more women report it. Right? Men might be hiding it or not able to interpret what they're going through, right? Whatever might be the case. That can happen with women too, but some of that data is difficult to interpret. Often accompanied by symptoms of depression and anxiety. This is important. So stress doesn't exist necessarily just on its own as stress, but it's often linked to other mental disorders or challenges. And so you want to address stress before it develops into something like depression and anxiety. And then it costs, in the US, it costs about $300 billion per year, just the notion of stress. It's costly, primarily in work-related absences, days off, but also in terms of very direct links to disease, and I'll show you some of those links in a moment. So, in the United States, this is pre-COVID data. If we look at different age groups and how these age groups are reporting their stress levels, you can see that younger folks report higher levels of stress than older folks. This I find very interesting because as I get older, you can tell from my gray hair and a little bit of a beard, I think I'm stressed. Like, when I was younger, I don't know, I was stressed, but I didn't care, you're just kind of going. Now I'm like, I'm a little stressed out, I gotta take a break, right? But the reality is, when we look at these numbers, we begin to appreciate that stress is actually impacting these millennials at a higher rate than other groups. This is pre-COVID, and I remember on college campuses in the United States, we were very worried about our undergraduate population because they were reporting that they were stressed out, right? And some professors kind of cared about it, and other professors were like, oh, it's a game, that's how it works. Go home. I don't know. That should not be the goal, but it was something that we were aware of. Now, COVID hit, right? And so everybody's a train wreck, right? And I think we're only now starting to see things a little differently. I hope that we're more sensitive to the stress that everyone was experiencing at that time and how we've tried to adjust to it, right? And tried to make adaptations. But still, these differences may exist. I have seen data repeated post-COVID. Immediately post-COVID, it was skyrocketing, right? Everybody was stressed out. Now I'm not so sure where we are on these numbers. Cardiovascular disease, direct link mechanisms, very clear data, stress and illness, HIV/AIDS, the immune system, and its role in defending our bodies, there's a direct link. Stress, HIV, and your inability to adapt positively to the medication depression, viral cancers. This is very interesting, again, linked to the immune system. These are direct relationships. Now we have hinders the production of sex hormones, very, very interesting, but linked to menstrual cycle and other types of sexual dysfunction. And then the hinder the release of stomach acids, the digestive tract. This is associated with, mechanisms are still being investigated, but there seems to be a pretty clear link here. It's how and why it's happening is a little more difficult. Then it's associated with an increase in abdominal body fat. In particular, we'll talk about cortisol in a moment, but cortisol and body fat are linked, in particular visceral body fat. So there's some really nice mechanistic links there that people are looking at. And then it alters our behaviors that impact our health, right? We're stressed out, so we're not taking care of ourselves, right? Or we're participating in risky behavior, right? And that also can lead to ill health. Well, so my interests have been in stress and your heart, primarily because of my interest in physical activity. Physical activity solves all of our cardiovascular conditions, or at least we hope they do. And physical activity may, and at this time people were talking about its really stress reduction capabilities, right? And so that made me interested in looking at this, because there was very little research, and there still is actually very little research in this area. If your brain and your body are connected, they're one, right? Then I would argue that the benefits of physical activity that are linked to mental health are as important as any benefit that we see in the cardiovascular system or throughout the system. See what I'm saying? Yeah. Now that's me, and I'm sticking with it till I die. But not tonight. But I'm sticking with it, and that's how I approach my research. And so it's very biased. You're going to hear me talk in a very biased way here, because I'm really passionate about that concept, and there's enough evidence for us to have a great discussion about it, at least. The mind and the body being connected. So for me, you're hopefully not going to hear me say mind. I don't know what the mind is. I know what the brain is, right? And I think sometimes when we think about the mind, it's this kind of mystical thing, right? And it's okay with me, but I like the brain. It's there. It's cells. It's electrical impulses. It's neurochemistry. It's right there. That's what it is. And I want to study it, and we can be objective with it that way, I think. And then I suggest this book. Robert Sapolsky is a Stanford professor. He's written several books. He's what's called a crossover science to general public textbook. He uses scientific literature. This is the best book on stress. When a student is interested in studying with me, I tell them you have to read this book first. And usually they don't email back. But if they do, I usually have a really good student that's committed and interested in maybe coming and working with me. But I suggest if you're interested in this all, this is a good book. And Sapolsky is an excellent scientific writer. So the stress response, right? Central nervous system, fight or flight, here it is. I don't want to take too much time, but it's right here. The sympathetic division is the autonomic. That's the only part that we're looking at in the stress response and the fight or flight response, right? There's a lot more going on. I'm just going to focus on that, all right? And when we focus on this, from the central nervous system, it's coming from the hypothalamus. I'm not going to go through all of this, but it's going to release norepinephrine and epinephrine. These are two hormones that we can measure in the blood. The stress, these go up. These go up instantly. They're elevated instantly. It's like when you walk in and there's a snake and you instantly jump. That's the fight or flight response that kicked in. It's primarily the catecholamines that caused this tremendous alertness, and it's a physical response. It's the flight response, right? If you're normal. If you start to go after the snake, that would be the fight response. Maybe not so smart. Now, what you also have being prepared to be released is cortisol. Cortisol is often looked as like this very, very negative health, and it is, but it's also normal. What I want to make, the point I want to make here is, it's going to take 15 to 20 minutes after the alarm state, that initial alarm, that first 1 second, right? It's going to take 15 to 20 minutes before the cortisol is released. And the cortisol is primarily responsible for counter-regulating many of the mechanisms that have been activated by the epinephrine and norepinephrine, right? So your body is prepared for 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes of stress. Then it wants to shut off. That's how physiologically you have evolved. That has led to your survival for at least 300,000 years. Because we've been physiologically just about the same for 300,000. For 300,000 years, you have survived because of this stress response. That's it. Sorry, now you have to live with it, right? But most of us don't experience stress for 15 minutes, right? Stress is for us as humans in society today for 15 minutes. That would give you just enough time to get away from the saber-toothed tiger that was chasing you 300,000 years ago, right? And if you can't go fast enough, he eats you, and that's you don't survive, and you go on, right? But that was why, and then that's how it worked. But it doesn't, that physiology doesn't match the kind of coping that we need to handle stress today. So often we're looking at all of this activation. I won't go through that anymore, but one of the things that's missing here is the immune system. The immune system, primarily in response to cortisol release, is released and it activates the immune system so that when that saber-tooth bit into you and you were able to fight them off and you're bleeding, the immune system goes there to heal and initiates healing. This is just how humans work. It's a really brilliant system, and it's why we've survived. However, again, we don't open a wound, right? We're stressed for 3 weeks, right? And now our bodies have to figure out how it's going to cope with the elevated cortisol. And the immune system that's been activated, all right? And we'll talk about that in a moment. So in today's world, prolonged activation generally comes from psychological stressors, right? And the prolonged activation of stress response can lead to a number of illnesses. Those illnesses that I described are generally those. Now, so inflammation is this activation of the immune system that we're worried about, and that's happening. We're going to have an increase in blood flow caused by this inflammatory response. And they're caused by inflammatory cytokines, pro-inflammatory cytokines. Sorry I have to throw these terms out, but we're going to have to hang on to these for a little bit today in going through some of this information. And then these white blood cells migrate to the site of the infection or the injury. You see how that works? All of this is programmed. It's programmed in 15 minutes. All of this kicks into effect, and you're going to now survive whatever attacked you, or you're going to die, right? And if you die, it's okay because the person who survived, their physiology goes on, right? But again, we don't need that physiology. It's a mess. Don't want to get too much into this, but on this first point, it's these endothelial cells, the cells on the inner lining of your arteries. That's where plaque gets built up. That's where the initial process of plaque starts. That's the damage, that's the initial location of damage that your inflammatory cytokines are going to target, all right? It's the endothelial cells. Now, this leads to altered function linked to chronic vascular inflammation, atherogenesis, cardiovascular disease. It's just a sequence of events. And both mental stress and obesity are linked to the production of these pro-inflammatory cytokines. You know it, the literature is pretty clear here. And I have to mention that we also have anti-inflammatory cytokines that I'm not going to talk very much about. I think I have one study that'll talk about it. It's all about the pro side because that's the one that we want to regulate. The reality is it's a milieu, it's a mix of pro and anti. And I would argue that if you only look at pro-inflammatory cytokines, you're missing the other half. Because if anti-inflammatory cytokines are activated at the same time, you don't have a pro-inflammatory state, right? And we're getting closer to being able to identify the anti-inflammatories that are critical, especially in physical activity. Well, this is a model. We could spend probably 3 or 4 hours on this. I'm going to try to spend 30 seconds. I'm doing the very best I can here. See this pro-inflammatory monocyte? This is going to activate in here. It's going to become a foam cell with your LDL, your oxidative LDL, then it's going to go into, here's your plaque buildup under your endothelial wall. This is your coronary. This builds up, now we're occluding your artery, you occlude to the point where your blood can't get through, you have a heart attack, severe enough, you die. It's that simple. Not super complex. Now on top of that though, this can rupture. It's a different kind of heart attack. It ruptures, throws a clot. It causes the blockage, and then you can die. All right. So let's talk real quickly here about this process and how we've learned and who's played a critical role in learning how stress impacts the body. The first one to talk about the fight or flight response was actually Walter Cannon, and right about in 1932. Then Hans Selye really came up with an understanding, a theoretical proposal for how this stress response worked. And he did many studies. He had many students, and they continue to do a great deal of work in the area of stress. Ian Roddy is from the UK. He published a book called Physiology of Disease. He looked in particular at the cardiovascular responses to stress. I'm going to talk about his work because his work influenced my work more than any other stress researcher. And not just because he can speak English. Then we have Dean Spear coming along in 1989. For me, this is not that long ago. I finished my PhD in 1989, right? So this is like when I started and when I got married. And I remember that. And it wasn't that bad. What Dean Spear was proposing was the physiological mechanisms that you activate during physical activity. There's the stress response. You got choline, cortisol, you do some funny things with clearance cortisol. But it's the same activations, and that's why when you train aerobically primarily, although many would argue resistance exercises have some similar effects, you are better able to cope with a mental stress. That's the crossover, right? He was the first one to propose that, and he writes his paper in '89 is very well done. Creates a very nice case for this, and it's again another paper that we use in our work. John Cacioppo is the primary neuroscientist in the country since the early 2000s. I had him as a professor at the University of Iowa many years ago. Unfortunately, he passed away about 18 months ago, unexpectedly, at his desk. He's at his desk working, and his wife, it's a crazy story, I'm sorry, I'm just going to go off tangent just this one time. University of Chicago, a very prestigious institution. His wife is also interested in neuroscience, and they shared one desk. He would sit on one side of the desk, she would sit on the other side of the desk. They were extremely productive. Yeah, we couldn't do that. She can have her own desk. I'll lie. But what happened was, she came to work one day, and his head is in his book. He's dead. It's about 18 months ago. And he's probably 7 or 8 years older than I am, and very productive. And unfortunate, but he's done the most work today. And then there's this group of us here that have been working in this area for some time. Remember, I think I mentioned how Mark Holland has done work. He's done some really nice work. And then there's all these new frontiers that really need to be addressed in this century for sure. So, I'm going to talk real quickly on these next 2 slides because I want to jump into some studies that I can flow through pretty quickly on. There are different ways to examine stress in the lab. For humans, all of those are acute, right? You can't, ethics boards and committees and institutional review boards aren't going to allow you to bring in a human and like put them in a cage, right? That's just not going to work. Or stress them to the point where they faint, which is what Ian Roddy did. It was great. I'll tell you about that in a moment. But you can't do that. So Hans Selye did most of his research on animals, and the way he stumbled into this was he was taking care of rats in the lab. He was a neuroscientist, but he was doing rats. And a couple rats got out. And when they're out of their cages, they go crazy. They get really stressed out. They feel unprotected. And he noticed that their adrenal glands were swelling up. And that's what triggered his interest in stress. He started to examine it. Because also, they were very ill. He thought, oh, this is weird. What's going on here? And that's what triggered his interest. So you can have all kinds of lab-induced stressors. The trier-social stress task is a public speaking task. The most effective stressor in the lab is public speaking. That's humans. Humans are like that. They get really anxious. So if you get anxious public speaking, you're the norm. And if I look like I'm not anxious, yeah, I'm old. But if I look like I'm not anxious, I'm still a little anxious. I got to get a little charged up. I got to be a little focused. I think I had some green tea help me lock in a little bit. But those are the things that everybody, this is the number one for humans. This is it. And you can even enjoy it. Remember, it can be a positive stressor too, right? It's public speaking. Anyways, mental arithmetic and street color word test, these are very good and effective. And these are the ones that we've used primarily in our lab in different combinations. But more so, and what our lab is known for, is using population-specific stressors. Let's see if I can figure some of these out. It'll come up after Ronnie. What Ronnie would do is he brings a subject in. I love reading this stuff. Ronnie was interested in saying, you know, this stress, seeing heart rate increase, seeing blood pressure increase, what's the big deal? We know that happens. I want to see when a person faints, what happens to their vascular system. That's the point where we finally have a disruption of the system. And sure enough, that's what he would do. So, in the blood draw example, by the way, the government in the UK shut his lab down when they find out what he was doing. Yeah, but this is what he did. That's right. This is what I thought was brilliant. This is really good stuff. So anybody faint around blood? Yeah, right? And so the rest of some of you are lying, I know. But so some people faint. And so what he would do is he would have them fill out a questionnaire, and he would, if the ones that said that I faint would faint, well, you're a volunteer. We'll bring you right in. So he would, this is classic. The subject is here, a Confederate, somebody who's on the science team, right, is here. And they take blood from this person to see how this person's responding, right? If they respond pretty good, then what they do is, oh, okay, can you hold this? Have you ever held a test tube of blood? It's really warm. It's really weird. If you don't like, if you're faint, this is not good, right? This elevates it. Now, if the person does okay, like they're pretty good, then they go, okay, well, let me take your blood. So then they stick them, and they miss. and then they stick them again, right? Because you want to get them anxious and you want to see if you can get them to faint. Because that's where the rich data is. So you stick them again. And then, this is classic. They still don't faint. Let's say the person's still going there. He would turn and drop the blood. And this, he got most of them. But he would just keep elevating the amount of stress until he fainted. And then he would examine physiologically what was happening to the cardiovascular system. And some of the data he has, if you get a chance to read this article, it is the most amazing data you've ever seen, because it is real world what the body does when it is stressed over the top. Right? It is unbelievable. This vasodilation that causes you to lose blood pressure and blood flow to the brain happens instantly. Your vessels just go boom. They just wide open, and you hit the ground and you're out. Now, he, in his writing, talks about this being similar to what happens to a possum. We call them a possum. You need a picture of a possum. You know what an opossum is? It's like a big rat, and they go in your trash, and they eat all your trash, and everybody's upset, and my wife tells me to go get them. But these possums, they play dead, right? They get scared, they get startled, and they go, right? Now, they're not playing dead, they fainted. And so he said, we play dead. We're programmed because we can't handle the stressor, so we play dead. Now, not all of us, but that's what's happening. And he shows all this data. It's wonderful data. He does the same thing with a lab fire. He brings in one of the researchers from down the hall. He wants to see if he can get him to faint. Brings him to the lab, and then he pipes in smoke, fire, smoke through the door, so it smells like smoke. Yeah. Well, it's beautiful. What happens is the research, this is his colleague, right, whose office is down the hall. He goes, is that a fire? He goes, oh, it might be. Then the alarm goes off in the building. Oh, don't worry, it'll be okay. Now he's going to stick him with the needle at the same time, right? But let's just get some blood. So he sticks him with, and then a fire truck alarm comes in, right? And then a graduate student comes running in and tells her, your office is on fire. This is great stuff. This is amazing stuff. Never would get approved. But for me, it's really a wonderful plan to look at stress. I'm really telling you this because when we get to my stressors, we often are looking at an increase in heart rate of 12 to 18 beats per minute. Come on. And that's all they'll allow me to do. Right?
Come on, you have to be creative there.
Absolutely. So I have been creative. We'll go through a couple of things. We're still looking at very much. So we're not really stressing people. When I'm looking at pro-inflammatory cytokines with that kind of stress, it's not really very much. And so it's very, very difficult for me to say that this is what we're doing. You'll see some of the strategies we use to try to get around this. And so here we go. We've looked at cardiovascular responses, stress hormones, immune system responses, inflammatory responses, and then inflammatory cellular mechanisms. This is how our research protocols have developed over the years. In that time, we started with looking at athletes. We went to apparently healthy, then overweight and obese, which is a group that we continue to anchor on, and also aging. And you'll see how we looked at that. And we've had to make those adjustments so that people would give us money to do research. And we're looking at some cardiovascular indicators and also other inflammatory indicators. So what we do is we stress them in the lab, right? We're going to activate their brains, right? Then what we're going to do is we're going to look at cardiovascular reactivity, what's happening to the heart rate and blood pressure. No big surprise here. Then we're going to look at catecholamines and cortisol. These are your fight or flight hormones. We've got to show that those are being elevated. And then we're going to work our way over to inflammatory cytokines. Those inflammatory cytokines are going to come from this set of cells. This is just a blood tube, right? We spin down the blood tube. We have the plasma serum up here. We have the red blood cells here. This is the bumpy coat. This is where we're going to find the immune cells that produce the inflammatory cytokines, right? So we're going to pull those out, just this little bit, put it in a different test tube. Then we're going to spin that down, right? And we're going to look at peripheral blood mononuclear cells. This pile of cells right there, they're the cells that are the primary producers of inflammatory cytokines. So we have to do that just to get those cells. Then we've hired undergraduates, we have to pay them to do this. They're going to count 1 million of those, because we only need 1 million to do our analysis. We have to know the number of cells that are there that are producing a certain amount. So they count 1 million. It's not as hard as you think it is, but you have to be well trained, and they have to be perfect. So we check them, but we only need 1 million. When I first heard about these protocols, I was like, what are you talking about? So I had to go watch it, and I go, oh, okay. I guess it's reasonable. We're going to take those cells now. We're going to look at inflammatory mechanisms in those cells. This is the cell wall right here, right? It has receptors. We're going to attack these receptors with different stimulants in another test tube. And we're going to be able to look at receptor expression, transcriptional regulation, and inflammatory responses, all of these, right? So that's what we're going to be doing when we get there. It's going to take us years. It's going to take us years, more than, right about 30 years to get there, right? That's what it's going to take. So let's take a look at our first study here. We're just going to challenge folks. We're going to bring them in. We're going to propose a challenge on the treadmill. We're going to see if we can alter their anxiety or stress levels, and we're going to see if that has an impact on their physiological responses, right? So, why would we study this? We're going to have them already running on the treadmill, and then we're going to stress them. The proposed idea that we've been able to sell fairly effectively is that we actually think that it would be metabolically appropriate to have systems developed in order to evaluate the body's current physiological and mental status and have a mechanism in order to determine an appropriate response. This, to me, I find interesting. From a physiological standpoint, that's how it works. You increase your workload, your heart rate increases to a certain amount, you get stiff, you increase again, you do it. But if you add a mental stress, I wasn't convinced that this would hold, right? Mental stress is a little different, and it can be very unique. But still, this was where we started. Now, if we look at psychological stress, we see an increase in cardiovascular responses, we see an increase in catecholamine response, and we see an increase in cortisol in response to psychological stress. Many studies, many more than this, right? If we look at a physical stress, norepinephrine increases curvilinearly with an increase in workload, epinephrine increases at workloads above 60% of VO2, and cortisol increases with intensities greater than, we know all that stuff. So we know what we're dealing with in terms of these physiological adaptations in stress hormones to mental stress and physical stress, okay? Now, we had to go further in trying to explain why this is an important protocol, and here's one of them. Here's another reason for examining combinations of stress. Numerous occupations and individuals, law enforcement, firefighters, that's a group that we look at a lot. Military personnel, rescue workers, hospital workers, athletes are subject to inherent stress from physical dangers, psychological factors, physiological exertion in the course of their job performance, right? So in the real world, there are these people that have these multiple stressors. That's why we ought to look at these multiple stressors. Really, the only reason we're doing it is because I'm an exercise physiologist. But I can't say just that, right? So this is how we work. This is a long time ago. You can tell from my hair, not just the small screen. My hair, you can tell this is a long time ago. And we have these. They're all hooked up. We're measuring. This is wonderful equipment, isn't it? Somehow it worked. But this is some old stuff. This was old stuff then. They're looking at a runner on the treadmill. This is a runner that they know of. They may not have met him personally, but they're the best runner in a 5-state area. They're sub-elite, they're way up there. And they're told, you're going to run at the intensity that runner is running at, okay?
And you might want to tell them that's a television. They have an old television.
What's on my boy?
This is a, thank you. This is a TV, come on. Wait. This is a little television, yeah. And that's the biggest screen we could get. And I'm sure we didn't pay for it. Some kid probably brought it from their dorm room.
Got it.
And we have a VHS, one of the big camera things. It was beautiful. It worked. Like Brazil, it works. Come on. So here we have a picture of the runner, and we tell them the runner's going to be running 70% of VO2 max or 95% of VO2 max. And you just want to match, we're going to match their intensity, and we'll see how it goes. So, in addition, you tell them it's counterbalanced, but in reality, all of them will run 70% first, so we got to get our baseline data. And all of them will be presented with a video of this elite runner pouring with sweat, dying on the treadmill, just falling off at 95%. And we have a video of him, right? He is suffering greatly. And we tell the runner, we're going to change the intensity up to that intensity for you. It's your 95%. That's their 95, your 95%. I hope you can make it 20 minutes. Right? This is good. But what we do is, once we say that, we take our measures, and then the treadmill's broke, I'm sorry. They have to stay the same 70%. So the physiological demand is identical. We just try to alter the mental expectations of demand, right? So let's take a look at data. You would imagine that we're going to be able to perturb, let's say, their heart rate and ventilation because they're more mentally stressed, right? That's what we kind of thought. I wasn't sure that was going to happen, but we kind of thought. And the literature would say, so the first thing is, did they get anxious? This is the state anxiety inventory. How anxious are you? A couple little questions, all kinds of fun stuff. They were more stressed under the proposed challenge condition, right? When they were told they were going to run till they died. If they chose, then they were more stressed. But look at what happens here in terms of heart rate. Wow. We didn't perturb the heart rate. This is very interesting. I'm gonna have to find another job, right? And then if we look at ventilation, no change. We thought for sure ventilation would be more sensitive to this perturbation. It was not sensitive to the perturbation. Now, so we knew this was a possibility, and so we needed a background explanation for this. And sure enough, it was, we found it in really what we would refer to as this cross-stressor adaptation. What we would propose is that because, or actually physiological toughness, because they're so physiologically tuned in to the physiological stress, they're athletes, that you can do anything mentally and not perturb them. They're highly trained, and physiologically they're locked in. And sure enough, Deanspear does a great job describing that. He talks a lot about that. And we were able to use that as a rationale, and everything went fine. But it now left the door open for us to look at unfit people. We ought to be able to perturb them. And so that's, of course, our next series of studies. And remembering that this is going to lead to this cross-stressor adaptation. The benefits that we'll see from a mental stress related to the physiological adaptation. And we proposed this in 2017 in a review article. This is Aaron Slusher, one of my former doctoral students. And we said this would lead to emotional regulation or stability. And it's really one of the major areas of our research to this point. So fit, unfit, we brought them in and we tried to do the same kind of challenge. Somebody's dying on the treadmill. These are fit up, these are normal people. These are not athletes. It didn't work. They looked at us like, why would I do that? You know? And I couldn't do what Roddy did. I couldn't, lie to him or something. So we had to figure out, and everybody working in the lab were all athletes. We were all skinny. You saw me skinny with dark hair, right? We were all skinny with dark hair, right? All distance runners or triathletes or whatever, right? And we didn't know. We were like, come on, what's wrong with this? These humans are a mess. There's something wrong here. We figured out, oh, well, wait a minute, no, it's us. Right. And so we had to figure out some stressors. I was fortunate enough to run into an expert psychologist who uses these techniques. And so we learned about the street color word task, the mental arithmetic tasks. I think many of you are somewhat familiar with the street color word task. You just have to, for us, it's about, so this is, oh, that's yellow, sorry. See how it says blue here?